It is a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Raymond Hames, with whom I have shared many nights in the jungle among the Yanomama. And I am really pleased to announce we have just earned a national science, or applied for and were granted a National Science Foundation research grant to continue working together on my Yanomama data collection, and you'll be seeing a lot more of Ray around the University of Missouri. I recall the first time I met Ray Hames, one of my former professors, Elman Service, had moved to the University of California at Santa Barbara, which touched off a progression of University of Michigan former professors to move west. And when I was offered a position at the University of California at Santa Barbara, it was like accepting a position back home, only moved among the palm trees. And so I enthusiastically accepted it. I recall, and what my former professor, Elman Service, mentioned to me when I told him that I had taken a job at Penn State, but couldn't find any cultural anthropology graduate students to take into the jungle with me. He said, well, why don't you consider one of my former students who had studied as a Peace Corpsman the same village in Paraguay that I had written a monograph about, Tobati. So Elman sent me his CV and his accomplishments, and I snapped him right up and brought him to Penn State, and we went off to the jungle. So we've had a lot of time in the jungle together during several different research projects. And I recall after Ray got his PhD and got his first job as an assistant professor, I can't remember where it was, Nebraska. Oh, that place. That I think he introduced me, or I introduced him for a talk that he was presenting. And when he took the podium, he said, my talk today is going to be about X, but I would like to preface this talk with my gratefulness to my research assistant, Napoleon Chagnon. At that time, I was a full professor with tenure, so today I get revenge. And I would like to introduce Ray Hames, my research associate. And you'll be seeing a lot of Ray at the University of Missouri over the next several years as our research project develops and grows more hair. So, with that, no further ado, Ray, take to the stage. As they say at University of Michigan, players, take the field.
Thank you, Knapp, for that kind introduction. I was wondering what the revenge would be, but so I'm a research associate, not an assistant. Okay. I'd like to thank the program committee for inviting me to give you this talk today. It's going to be kind of taking stock on kin selection in humans. And I think it's good that we do this. And this is kind of the general course of action that we're going to take up here today. A brief history, very brief history of kin selection in humans. Reception of kin selection in anthropology. I don't know if I should have put that there. It hasn't been well accepted in anthropology for a variety of reasons, but I thought I would go through it a little bit. The various approaches to kin selection. And here we're going to be talking about the kind of division of labor that's been established between evolutionary psychology, behavioral ecologists, and others in kind of looking at kin selection from a variety of different analytic dimensions. Topical areas, and kin selection is really interesting because it engages us from things such as alloparental care to coalitionary violence. And that covers a really wide range of human behavior, and so it really, I'm going to try and make an argument that it permeates much of our everyday social behavior. And then also what we've established, or I think we've established pretty well. And then some of the work ahead. So this is going to be the plan of attack for the talk today. And what is kin selection or inclusive fitness? Most everybody here knows exactly what this is in a general sort of way. Devised by W.D. Hamilton, presaged by others, Haldane and Fisher in the 30s, and designed to account for apparently altruistic behaviors, and altruism being any behavior which reduces the fitness of the actor while enhancing the fitness of the recipient. And of course, this is not really accurate in terms of inclusive fitness, because if it works right, then the fitness of the actor is enhanced. Do we need to worry? Most of you are probably aware of this piece of research. What do the evolutionary biologists say? I can use a kind of ad popularum argument. 150 great evolutionary biologists said this is baloney, but that's not a really good critique of what this paper is about. But there is some contention in the area. I don't have the mathematical expertise to kind of delve into this sort of issue. But he says in response that Novak does, he and his colleagues did not negate the importance of relatedness in the evolution of eusociality, as critics say. My response is good thing, because we have ample empirical evidence that it does work. There's a kind of issue, was he really talking about eusociality and not other species that are not eusocial? But in any event, who knows how this is going to be resolved, but I don't think we have to worry about it too much. Here's a simple model. You're all familiar with this kind of simple model of kin selection, relatedness and benefits being greater than the cost. And all things being equal, kin selection suggests that one will be helpful or altruistic to kin in proportion to their degree of relatedness. But all things are rarely equal. This is where the costs and benefits come into play. The following are some of the things that affect return on benefits to recipient. Again, this is a pretty standard sort of thing. Reproductive value is really important. And what I'm going to try and argue is that if you look at the research on kin selection, benefits flow downhill. They go from older to younger in all sorts of different domains of altruistic behavior. Perhaps it's obvious in our culture. It seems obvious that we are nicer to kin than non-kin and nicer to close kin than distant kin. Anthropologists have documented kinship is fundamental to the organization of egalitarian societies and is still important in complex societies. So the question I always ask is, why didn't an anthropologist invent kin selection theory? When we knew the importance of kinship, when we knew how to measure relatedness in terms of what our biological and anthropological cousins did, but we didn't. Here are some of the oppositions to kin selection in anthropology. One is the genealogical grid is arbitrary and culturally specific to Western, and is a specific Western imposition on ethnographic reality. And I say, that's probably right, but we can kind of deal with this, I think, in an easy way. Many kinship terminological systems are not perfectly conceptualized genetically. Instead, they are based on arbitrary cultural conventions, such as cross and parallel distinctions. Here's an example of what I mean. It's kind of hard to operate this Okay. Told you it was hard. There's a clamp right here in front of the track field, and so I kind of have to, it'll evidently fall off. There we go. Any social anthropologist knows what this is: cross-parallel distinctions, an Iroquois kinship terminological system, kind of terminological system the Yanomami use. And the criticism here is that, for example, if you look at the reds, they're both mothers. One's related by 1/2, one's related by 1/4. Or you have parallel cousins who have the same term as siblings, And so, they're not making distinctions that differentiate between different kinds of kin who are related by different degrees of relatedness. The easy answer in terms of this system is that it's not so much a system of tracking kinship, but a way of dividing people into marriageable and unmarriageable individuals, and doesn't deal with the kinds of issues that necessarily interest us in kin selection. I'm looking for a clock around here. Do we have one? Okay, when did I start?
You have until 4.
Until 4? All right. One fear is it's a form of biological reductionism, or evolution is okay for the body, but irrelevant or even dangerous for mind and behavior. And then there's the other issue, kinship is bilateral, but descent systems are frequently unilineal. This is a reasonable concern because we have these interesting organizations that seem like they're built on kinship, and in fact they are, but they don't work out in terms of relatedness. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Here's some of the objections, or answers to the objections. I'm not going to go over that, but instead what I want to do is to kind of get to the history of the applications of kin selection to humans. And I would say that Dick Alexander is the person that really stepped up and took a look at Hamilton's theory of inclusive fitness and then tried to empirically apply it to anthropology. And this was done in The Evolution of Social Behavior, which from my perspective was one of the most formative things I've ever read in my life in terms of really moving me towards being an evolutionary anthropologist, and also in Darwinism and Human Affairs. But what he did was he began to look at food and labor exchanges, and curiously, he used Marshall Solons's The Sociology of Primitive Exchange, where Solons made the argument that kinship and residential proximity determined, the kind of altruistic flow of goods in tribal populations. Of course, Solons later went on to deny this was true, even though Dick took him exactly at his word in terms of what he was saying. And then coalitionary violence, he thought it was a good model for coalitionary violence. And then also paternity certainty. And if you had to look at anything, it's probably him recognizing the problem of paternity certainty. And he used it trying to solve the issue of matrilineal descent and patrilineal descent, and where men were investing in their sisters' children instead of their own children. How does this make sense? And the nice thing about what he did was to essentially, and others have done this, for example, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, they would take an apparent challenge to inclusive fitness theory or some kind of evolutionary biological theory and see if you could work your way around it. And Martin and Margot did this in terms of infanticide and found that the patterns they predicted made sense in an evolutionary sense. What I want to point out is that no mention that I could find was made in Wilson's sociobiology on the role of kin selection as important in human behavior. He talked about it for the eusocial insects and things of that nature, but it was really Alexander who showed that it could be applied to human behavior. So, here's where I'm going to be nice to you. Who was the first to publish an empirical study on kin selection in humans? This guy. That's his celebration after he showed that it worked. But in any event, Knapp in a paper, 1975, look at that date. Genealogy, solidarity, and relatedness, limits to local group size and patterns of fissioning in an expanding population. And there he showed that relatedness was really important in terms of village fissioning. And fissioning led to, you have a large village, they can't get along, lots of fights occur, kinship mechanisms can't be used to solve those fights. Fissions occur, and all of a sudden the relatedness increases in both of the villages. Those of you who are considering a field kind of orientation, take a really good look at this picture because it has really important sorts of things that you need in the field. On the back there, this is Knapp's home office, by the way, in a Yanomamo Shabana. Duct tape, you see it there, absolutely essential. One day we were bored and waiting for a flight, and we sat down and made a list of all the uses of duct tape that we could think of. And we each came up with about 25 uses, and hardly any of them overlap. Some of them did. But it's really important for a field worker. By his left hand, or his hands clasped together, Tabasco. And this is more specifically for when you get a piece of 4-day-old meat from the Yanomamo, you really want to shake that Tabasco on it. You'll see I'm sorry, I really don't have a pointer that works here. There's a shotgun, which is really important if you want fresh meat. And also, you really can't be a normal male. Does that work?
Yeah, the top button does.
Oh, the top button. What is it doing? Oh, I see. There's a shotgun. In fact, you know, it's unseemly for any male to not have a weapon in that culture. I remember one time I was leaving the village. I was going to watch some women collect some firewood and following them out, and then somebody yelled at me, "You're naked." And I looked at myself. No, I've got plenty of clothes on. You're naked. And I found out that that naked meant unarmed. And so they told me to fetch my shotgun to watch the women, and also if I had an opportunity to get a bird in the evening. And then the last piece, where is it? You know what that is? Insecticide. So these are some of the things that if this picture, you know, really says a lot. Okay, and then with Bill Irons sitting down in front next to Knapp in 1976, they had this very controversial conference at the American Anthropological Association. And the association has never really gotten over that conference. But in any event, so these are, you know, some of the earliest applications of kin selection theory by human researchers. So we've got, you know, two basic approaches in anthropology, also known as behavioral ecology, ethnographic and observational, demography and historical demography, non-Western populations, and focus on behavior or association with survivorship and reproduction. That's the kind of focus we have in behavioral ecology. In evolutionary psychology, a different approach because they're trying to seek answers to a different set of questions. And so it's laboratory experimental, survey questionnaires, scenario responses, focus on the mind, feeling, attitudes, belief, or evolved mental architectures, surveys of past behavior, and a focus, and I won't press this too hard, on Western populations or weird samples, because it turns out that this is changing very rapidly in that evolutionary psychologists are investigating non-Western people, or behavioral ecologists are taking evolutionary psychological approaches and looking at their non-Western samples. For example, the work of Frank Marlowe on the Hadza, or Hilly Kaplan and Mike Gervin's group on the Tsimane, beginning to incorporate kind of evolutionary psychological mechanisms. And there's kind of like overlap, you know, both two anthropologists there, Deborah Judge and Sarah Hurdy, who are anthropologists, I think, although Sarah wants to be a sociobiologist. But in any event, and Smith, who's an evolutionary psychologist, they study the same sorts of phenomena. So there's a lot of overlap. And so what I want to go through now is some of the, you know, the division of labor. The first two on are kin recognition, and then feeling, attitudes, and orientations towards kin are largely done by evolutionary psychologists. Behavior towards kin and non-kin by both, but a big focus on anthropology, by anthropologists, and kin impact on fitness, survivorship, growth and development, and fertility, which is done by both, but much more frequently by anthropologists. Historical demographers, work in this kind of issue. And so these are kind of like, if I had to kind of make up a division of labor, we'll go through the topics a bit later on. This is how I would do it. And here are some of the topics that I want to consider. The first two I've mentioned, kin recognition, feeling about kin, cooperative breeding, which has generated a huge literature, general behavior towards kin, contact, helping behavior, etc., paternity certainty, wills, adoptions, coalitions, food and labor exchanges, and sex differences. That is, I'm going to make an argument that females are much more invested in kin-directed activities than are males. So with that, we'll start moving through these areas. How do we recognize kin? We have some really good work by Deb Lieberman and John Tooby and Lydia Kuzmides. And basically, this is a kind of an old anthropological issue about theories of incest avoidance that do relate to kinship. But basically, as most of you know, Westermarck argued that co-residence led to later sexual aversion among individuals. And so the kind of model and research that was postulated was that there was this kind of mental kinship estimator that took inputs on early co-residence. And the second kind of innovation that Westermarck really didn't deal with was viewing one's mother caring for a young child, also known as maternal perinatal association, or MPA, which kind of dealt with the problem, for example, if close daily interaction in a family is supposed to be the mechanism, what about, let's say, a male who is 18 when his one-year-old sister is around? He doesn't have that opportunity to have daily interaction, but if he sees the mother caring intensively for this little kid, then he will grow to believe that this is a sister. And so this was a real nice kind of advance on the Westermarck effect. But the critical thing in terms of what we're talking about is, the issue is, how do we recognize kin? Well, here's one mechanism for recognizing kin. Leads to two things. One is sexual aversion, and as the research shows, an increase in altruistic tendencies among people who have differential kind of inputs in these areas. But the kind of question I would ask later on, and maybe Deb can answer this, is that, well, that's just identifying family members. We've got uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews, cousins, grandparents that are all kin. How do we learn to recognize these individuals? And I threw this out. Could MPA be a mechanism for grandparental altruism? That is, if you see a daughter caring for a child, then it's your daughter caring for a particular child. Could that be a kind of stimulus that would lead to the development of feelings of affection and concern and empathy in grandparents? But that still leaves out aunts, uncles, and all the rest. So we've made a good start in terms of this kind of limited area, but I think we have much more to do. Phenotypic matching is another kind of mechanism postulated to help us identify kin, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that in a couple days from Lisa DeBrine. But she was able to show that group cooperation was enhanced by more self-resembling players in cooperative games, trust but not lust, less sexual attraction to individuals who are facially similar, but more trust, etc. And so, again, Lisa will be able to explain the results of this research much better than I. So there's another kind of mechanism out there that seems to be perhaps important for recognition of kin. Smell and major histocompatibility complex, some would argue it. I don't know that the data is very good to make that argument, but that's just a kind of another one that's out there. But I think the phenotypic matching in terms of facial resemblance has probably got much stronger data. The next topic I want to take on is feelings towards kin. And so the idea is, if you're going to behave altruistically towards kin, then you're going to have to kind of generate some feelings to move you to behave altruistically. And so we have all these kinds of psychological concepts: emotional closeness, emphatic concern, empathy, as being important. And and you have the various definitions that go on up there, where emotional closeness is defined as a sense of concern, trust, caring for another individual, and in enjoyment of the relationship with the individual. Then we have subjective closeness, emphatic concern, and on it goes. There's been some interesting research that I'll talk about a little bit later, use both emphatic concern and emotional concern, and found out that they were both correlated with a tendency to be altruistic or feel nice towards kin. And also, many of these studies show that women feel closer to kin, were more likely to assist, and this pattern intensified in middle and in old age, which would make sense in terms of the grandmother hypothesis. Park importantly notes that empathy ought to be the appropriate emotion to elicit altruism, because it's a demonstrated mediator of altruism. And he notes that a subjective sense of closeness is not an emotion per se, but it's really clear at this point that there are some emotions that are generated by close kinship that lead to a feeling of concern and readiness to help close kin. And then the work of Curry and the prolific work of Paulette, done lots of really good research on kin selection, talks about a kinship premium, and points to a deeper understanding of how kinship is an independent factor in altruism. Both studies replicate previous research showing emotional closeness is important to maintain helpful relationships among friends through reciprocation. However, both studies show that close kinship but not distant can be independent contributors to altruism, hence this kind of idea that he put forward of a kinship premium. Okay, I want to get topical now. Talk about helpers at nest. Here's a picture of a Yanomama woman caring for a child. And there's been some really interesting research in this area that is, I kind of don't quite know what to believe in this research, and we'll get to it in a minute. Basically, humans engage, I shouldn't say appear to engage in cooperative breeding, because I think they do engage in cooperative breeding. In that we have co-resident helpers assist mothers and fathers in provisioning or direct or indirect care of their offspring. So here we're talking about the helpers at the nest. We're talking about within family cooperation that goes on. If this common pattern behavior is adaptive, then helpers should have the following effects on their siblings and mothers. And so we're going to go through some research that points to this. Increase a mother's fertility, increase child's survivorship, enhance a sibling's growth and development, and lower morbidity, so things that essentially make the kid survive and grow and become healthy. And so we have a lot of these correlational studies out there that show, for example, the presence of a nearby grandmother do increase the survivorship of children, or the fertility of mothers. But we really don't quite know what the mechanisms are. Is it more food? Is it greater care? What is exactly going on? What's, for example, a grandmother doing? We have some ideas, but that hasn't been studied very well at all. The next thing I want to turn to is, why do we need alloparental care? Well, I I think Hilly Kaplan may have invented this term stacking. Does that seem right to people? He uses that term. Producing a lot of offspring that are fully dependent on parents and can't make it on their own, having like a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 12-year-old. That's stacking, okay? So one pattern in human reproduction is, we have these multiple dependent offspring, such that optimal child care may be beyond the economic productivity of parents. I would argue this sets the stage for kin-directed altruism. And there are 2 really interesting publications. One just came out by Paul Hooper and colleagues on the Chimane, and another one by Kim Hill and Ana Magdalena Hurtado on the Hiwi and the Ache, which really surprised the hell out of me as an economic anthropologist. Because what they essentially showed is that young families can't produce enough food to feed their offspring. Why didn't economic anthropologists learn this kind of earlier, or anything of that nature? So the question, really is, how common is this phenomena? Here's, in the recent publication, I want you to look at the bottom line, and that's the net family balance. Anything above 0 means that they're producing enough food to feed their own families. Anything below that line shows that they aren't producing enough food to feed their own family. And so what we see, early couples, that's kind of understandable. But the problem with early couples, they tend to have a lot of sex and they get pregnant. And so the number of offspring increases. And it's not till parents are about 40 years of age are they able to produce enough food to feed their own offspring. And again, as an economic anthropologist, this is a really surprising result. But now that group, the Chimane, a little bit like the Yanomamo, in that they do most of the calories they gain from farming with some hunting, gathering, and fishing. And so a fairly typical Amazonian group. But then we turn to these 2 populations. You all know the Ache. And you get the same parallel result. We have a large fraction, if you look at the wife's age, of individuals or families, as it turns out, who aren't producing enough food to feed their own families. And it doesn't get much better with age, and the triangles are monogamous families, and you see that the problem is more pronounced among the circles. I don't know if they've done a statistical analysis of this with the polygynous families, although it kind of gives me a little bit of insight into my own research, because what I've found, for example, among the Yanomamo is that if you look at food distributions, polygynous families get more than monogamous families, even controlling for the number of offspring in their families. And then if you look at the Hiwi, another hunting and gathering group, it's not quite as bad, but there's still a number of families that are operating at a net energetic deficit. So this suggests, that the very nature of human reproduction in relation to their subsistence system sets the stage for kin selection to work, because somebody has to come in and make up these deficits through some form of assistance. And it's clearly not most of the case. It's not siblings with older, for example, siblings in the family, although very older siblings might be helping out, but it's others. And what they are able to kind of, this is a generalized version of this, with female production and male production. And it turns out that males are making a much bigger contribution to the family. So, this suggests that, families have to rely on others in order to make it. And the question is who those others are. There are two answers to it. According to the Ache and the Hiwi research, it's all these unmarried males who are adding resources to these families that essentially can't make it. The really detailed analysis for the Chimani by Paul Hooper is that it is largely grandparents. And it turns out more grandfathers than grandmothers, which we'll get into a little bit later when we talk about the grandmother hypothesis and how that is implicated in kin selection theory. Some of the early studies, again, we're kind of getting historical, showed that daughters are really important in terms of enhancing the reproduction and survivorship in certain populations. Turkin, Betzig, Anifaluk. Mothers that had firstborn daughters had higher fertility than mothers with firstborn sons. The most fertile women were those whose first and secondborns were girls, while women with the lowest fertility had first and secondborn boys. So the idea here is that there's an advantage in this kind of helpers at the nest situation if the offspring early on are girls. Mark Flynn tried to take up this, wasn't able to replicate the results, but did find some interesting dimensions here. Mothers who had co-resident but non-reproductive females, pre or postmenopausal in their household, had higher reproductive success, so suggesting there's input from these helpers. And some other patterns too that suggested that having helpers, particularly female helpers, made a really big difference in fitness. Probably the most spectacular finding on birth order effect on fitness. I always wondered how to pronounce his name. Anybody know what it is? He's done great research. Huh? Beretche? Okay. But he always comes up with great. Is that you? No? Okay. But anyway, he found firstborn girls were made at home longer than firstborn sons or secondborn daughters. Women with firstborn daughters had shorter birth intervals, speeding up reproduction, a longer reproductive span, and higher fertility, obviously, if they have earlier born and narrow interbirth intervals. And the time allocation data that he collected revealed that the mechanism for this reproductive enhancement was found in a greater amount of helping activities such as housework and childcare engaged by daughters. So it's not that they were producing more food for the household, but probably they were sparing the mother from having to do that work so she could become a more effective economic investor in her own offspring. Then Pat Draper and I tried to replicate the research. Didn't find anything at all. We looked at the best case versus the worst case scenario by Betzig and Turk. Two firstborn, or the first two are females born, the first two are males born. And we found no significant difference in terms of fertility or survivorship to age 12 among the hunting and gathering group, the San Bushmen. Our results, in retrospect, may be a consequence of a small sample size, but I'm still not sure because there's so little difference between the two. I'm going to talk about some of my own research on the equana, on helpers at the nest, or alloparental care in general. They're a group of tropical foraging, tropical forest farming horticulturalists. They live in these kind of big houses with small houses settled around. There's a look at a polygynous family there. Nice beaded pubic aprons, and a favorite informant, that nap-nosed Simeon, and way up in the headwaters of the Padamo River. And if you look at percent time in direct care of kids 2 years of age or less, the surprising result that I got was that mom only took care of the highly dependent offspring about half the time, but that we have sisters, grandmothers, aunts, and female cousins who spent the balance of the time caring for the child in and pretty much a straightforward kind of kin selection prediction. If you add everybody else in, then it gets a bit messier because males don't play much of a role. You can see that fathers are hardly engaging in any direct care. And by direct care, I mean holding, feeding, comforting, some kind of interactive physical contact. Males just don't do it much at all. Now we're going to move from kind of like this helpers at the nest within family enhancement of reproduction to the well-known work of Kristen Hawkes. And no matter what position you take on the grandmother hypothesis, one thing you have to admit is that it's generated a tremendous amount of research, which is really good because she put out a model about the role of grandmothers, and it was clear enough and specific enough so people could go out and test this kind of model. So those are the two papers that kind of touched off this interest in the topic. And I think I see Rebecca in the audience. Sear, is Ruth Mesa somewhere? Maybe, there we go, okay. This was a really important comparative study done. So they, essentially didn't quite do a meta-analysis, but what they did was to show that, in general, as predicted by Kristen Hawkes, that the maternal grandmother was really, really important in enhancing survivorship or reproduction of offspring. And here are some of the results, and then another paper also kind of looked at it in the modern context, and again, summarizing some of the really good work on the topic. And so we have this situation where, and what's really interesting, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but in the Sear and Mace paper, I don't think they use the word kin selection once. Which, it is a model of kin selection because it has to do with grandparents investing in offspring. But maybe, kin selection is so familiar you didn't have to say it, et cetera, but anyway. And there have been really, a number of studies. Here's a really good study done that looked at fecundity, which is kind of like raw reproduction, and whether the mother's grandmother was dead or alive, and lifetime reproductive success, which is a measure of relative fitness in terms of the number of surviving children. Again, if the mother's grandmother was alive, then it's higher. And then, we got this issue of phenotypic correlations, maybe because there's higher fertility for certain kinds of kids because they're from a long-lived line, et cetera, et cetera. So if we looked at dispersed and local, which is kind of like the ability to deliver input into these families, then you find that if the mother's grandmother lived locally, then the fertility was much higher. If she was dead versus alive, then her first stage at reproduction, if she was dead, was delayed, and if her first stage at reproduction, if her grandmother was alive. And again, so we've got a lot of these really good demographic studies, but again, what exactly are the grandmas doing in this arena? I won't go into the critiques of it. Kind of running out of time, but good research, because it's explicit, you expose yourself, and then so you open yourself up to criticism. But I want to talk about the role of fathers and grandfathers because this is another avenue for kin selection. It's really clear that grandmothers make a huge difference in terms of the fitness of their daughters. And if we look at Kristen Hawkes' model, this is discounted for a couple of reasons. One is that when males are engaged in economic activities, it's really a kind of mating effort. They're showing off. They're getting the big game animals. And then they're distributing their resources to all these other families that are distantly related and not investing in their own families. So what looks like economic productivity for the family really is not quite it. And then also what we call the father effect, in some of the research summarized by Mason and Sear, is that if dad dies, hardly any effect on the survivorship of the orphan kids, but compared to the mother, there's a major effect. But what I would argue is that the effect of male economic investment, and this is later going to be, not talking here specifically about parental investment, we're going to talk about grandparental investment, really depends on the nature of the economic system in terms of who's going to be investing more. And for example, we've been unable, or Hill and Hurtado have been unable to find any grandmother effect among the Ache. And the reason for it is fairly simple, I think, is because males produce 80% of the food. There's not much they can do. And then also looking at we have this curious situation with the Hiwi that I talked about before and the Ache. You have all these males who are unmarried and they're producing food and they're giving it to households. And the Chimane data shows that these are closely related males. The Ache and the Hiwi data is really unclear. But it looks like they're engaging in some kind of investment in case if a mating opportunity comes up, they're demonstrating that they have some kind of competence. But what I want to look at is this, and this is again surprising to me as an economic anthropologist. If you look at the father's contribution to children, FC, mother's contribution to children, you see this difference, and which showing that essentially males are contributing more. But the important thing that goes on, if you look at the grandfather's contribution, pretty much greater than the grandmother's contribution until I guess he gets totally decrepit and falls off, but grandma still keeps going along. But so the point is that these kin over here are contributing a lot, and it looks like there can be a grandfather effect. It's just not a grandmother effect. But this paper is a bit narrow in that it just talks about calories brought in. What about childcare? What about fuel gathering? What about all those other sorts of activities that are really helpful? That's not counted in this model. And what we know about childcare in these kind of populations is that there's a lot of sources of environmental trauma, and you have to essentially care for the child by keeping the child on you, which is a form of active care. So, but nevertheless, this is interesting, which to me, and again, the results are really unusual, and it's a matter of the ecological situation determining who is going to contribute or who has the ability to contribute in these sorts of situations. Anyway, if you look at these conclusions here, it shows by and large, that daughters, grandmothers, etc., do more in terms of enhancing the survivorship of children, the fertility of their close kin. But in some populations, unmarried males may play a crucial role, or grandfathers may play a crucial role. So I think we can show that kin selection is really important in the kind of basics of the family. With the time remaining, I think I'm going to kind of go very quickly through this some evolutionary psychological research. But there's been a tremendous amount of research done in evolutionary psychology in terms of asking people through a variety of questionnaires or experimental situations what one would do for kin and non-kin, how often people interact with kin versus non-kin, everyday help versus extraordinary help. And one thing we find is that it's not kin selection that governs cooperation in many populations on a daily basis. It's reciprocal altruism. So in the cost of help is fairly cheap. You know, like, for example, you need a ride to work versus getting bailed out of jail, which could cost thousands of dollars. You know, you depend on friends for the daily sort of stuff, and you find kin are really important in the extraordinary acts of altruism. And that's something that is really apparent in terms of in the modern context, and I would also argue in the tribal context, where you know, reciprocal altruism is a rival, in effect, competitor, theoretical competitor to kin selection. But anyways, here are some of the general findings, and again, I'm skipping over this stuff. Willingness to help, low or high cost declines with relatedness, lower expectations of reciprocity for kin than non-kin. And so kin can fail to repay, and they're still appreciated. You dump friends who fail to be there for you when you've been there for them. That's fairly evident in the research. And again, this is research done on modern populations. More help on a daily basis from friends, but high cost or benefit help biased by kinship, extraordinary altruism. Okay, next topic, paternity certainty. I have a lot of problems with paternity certainty because after reading Kermit Anderson, I can't believe that the rates of paternity uncertainty are as high as expected for this model. But you know, maybe natural selection is working on the margins here. But anyway, this is, you know, what a kind of idea that Dick Alexander made explicit about the problems of paternity certainty, and has generated a tremendous amount of research because it was so, again, clear. But anyway, he wanted to examine matrilineal systems. It didn't make any sense to him that men would be investing in their sisters' children compared to their own children. For cultural anthropologists, this was no problem because the sister's child is in the same lineage, matrilineage, as his mother's brother is, etc. And the issue he brought up was, you know, why are you not investing in your own child, related to you by 1/2, and instead you're investing in a child, a nephew, who's related to you by 1/4. And Penelope Green and Jeff Curlin did some calculations which showed that if paternity certainty was 27%, it would pay to invest in sisters' children. I have a hard time, you know, dealing with this figure, but in any event, one thing that was neglected to be pointed out is that divorce rates are higher in matrilineal than patrilineal societies. As a consequence, with your second wife, you know that her children aren't yours anyway. So it's a kind of paternity certainty that's not uncertain at all. But anyway, some research by Steve Gollin and Alice Schlegel showed that more extramarital sex by females and lack of a double standard in matrilineal societies. So the possibility was there, and that was one test implication. If paternity certainty is so low, then we would expect these sorts of things to be true in those kind of systems. And so a lot of research has been done. And again, by Steve Gollin and his colleague McBurney, Harold Euler on grandparents, anyway, aunts and uncles. And what we see systematically is that there's this matrilateral bias everywhere we look in terms of grandparents' emotional closeness, contact frequency, gift giving, favorite grandparent, mourning. They're more saddened by the death of a maternal grandmother. Amount of time interacting, you know, lots of data on this. And these are some, I tried to get Catherine to tell me where the hell she got these, but we think they may, but they're nice because they illustrate some of the results. The majority of participants spent most time with their maternal grandmother, and you see, you know, she always looms large in the lives of her grandchildren, or felt emotionally close to their maternal grandmothers. And any of you teaching this in a course, as I do, if you have a course of about maybe 50 people, ask the following 3 questions. You know, who do you feel closer to? Your maternal grandmother, your paternal, or both equally? And in large classes, you always see that, you know, maternal kind of it's about 2/3 will answer that. And so it's a kind of good teaching device because they can access it very, very, very quickly. And then, you know, again, more of a modest, but, you know, this is what we find again and again in modern societies. Okay. This is a really good study that I'm also going to skip because I want to move along. But here's, very briefly, a nice study done by Jung and David Buss that basically shows that it extends to cousins. Maternal cousins are more favored than paternal cousins. They feel closer to one another, which is, you know, really kind of novel and perhaps startling extension of the model. And so this is the problem, well, I have with the kind of paternity certainty kind of explanation. But then, you know, what else could contribute to the matrolateral bias? So I better shut up since I don't have a good alternative to it. But still, I'm troubled by the, you know, comparative research by Kermit that shows that, you know, it's pretty low just about wherever we look. And so it's really high, about 25%, if we're looking at men who have doubts about whether the child is theirs and they go in for paternity testing. Okay, that's when it gets, you know, potentially to that threshold postulated by Curlin and Green. Okay, I really like this literature. Last chance to invest. Okay, you're making out your last will and testament, and you've got a fair amount of money. So this is your last chance to enhance your inclusive fitness, right? And so why we don't have more of these studies is beyond me, because there are all sorts of really interesting implications that you could look at. But we have the work of 2 people in the audience, Deb Judge and Sarah Hurdy, looked at a variety of different wills. And basically, you know, what you find, and again, and some of this work by Webster and Smith, where Webster was experimental, but looked at a good sample of probated wills, 1,200 and with 4,800 beneficiaries. You know, this is pretty much the kind of result we see, in that you look at this kind of kin-biased pattern. And one thing that's interesting is that you see where there's equal relatedness, it's reproductive value that matters. You know, you don't invest in a 84-year-old male relative, you invest in a 12-year-old male relative of equal relatedness, because the 12-year-old can better parlay your investment into fitness. Spouses, you know, get more than anybody. They're unrelated. What's going on there? Well, because they have common offspring they're investing in. Except I think females tend to give less to their husbands because they, I guess they don't trust them. Sarah's nodding her head. Because they might use that for not parental effort, but for mating effort, I suppose is the answer. And then also, one kind of interesting output of this research is that there seems to be a lineal bias, in that collaterals, even if you control for age and sex, don't get as much as lineals. And I think it was Webster who noted this across, I think, all 3 studies. And he gives us 5 different answers why he thinks it may be true. I'm not sure which one is is the accurate one, but that would be a great area of research for people to do. Adoption. Again, the cross-cultural research on adoption shows that it is highly kin biased. And adoption is, really interesting. Why would you give up a child, if it's your own child, when you probably should know that it's not going to be cared for as well? But the work of Joan Silk on this topic across in Oceania, Africa, among the Inuit, found, these sorts of patterns that, again, make sense in terms of kin selection theory. Close kin are the most likely adopters of children, etc. Biological parents monitor the welfare of their children, place their children in households that are wealthier than theirs. And so when children are given up for adoption, it appears that the pattern is that they're thinking about their inclusive fitness. But there's kind of an applied dimension of this research that Martin Daly and Gretchen Perry are here. We've got this kind of kin selection model in the law now, in that federal law encourages fostering and adoption. Congress expressly encourages states to give preference to a relative when deciding where to place a particular child. Okay, so they got it right. They understand that somehow kin are going to make better parents than individuals who are unrelated to a child they're adopting. While some studies show that kin fostering leads to better results, educational attainment, employment, fewer legal problems, and stability, other studies show no difference. So what's going on there? My read, and I can be corrected, of the literature is that kids feel better about being placed among close kin. But is that the result that we're seeking? And anyway, Perry and Daly note that stability is regarded as the optimal outcome by adoption agencies, while they downplay other factors. Why do they regard stability as the optimum outcome? It's because they don't have to be bothered again. The child's been adopted, so it's a bureaucratic, but also, it sounds like it's good. The child is not bolting from the family and wanting to be adopted again. But, what about the probability of being incarcerated, lifetime earnings or something of that nature? Why isn't that also a good measure? So this is an interesting kind of area of research that talks about the value, I think, of applied evolutionary approaches to the study of social sorts of issues. Okay. Now we get back to a little bit of my research, a little bit of Knapp's research, coalitions and kinship. So we've gone from adoption, alloparental care, and how we feel about kin, and now we're going to talk about some warfare. And I took this picture outside my window, a group of Yanomamo warriors who had come up river, and they were going to persuade my guys to join them. And I think they probably got a raiding party of about 70 individuals. And what had happened about 2 weeks before, let's say we'll call it the downriver group and the upriver group, and my group was in the downriver group, they had a meeting with some long-term enemies, and there was a little trickery involved as far as I could understand. But 5 people were killed in this kind of gathering that was supposed to be a kind of reconciliation, but it turned out, as far as I could tell, was an ambush. But I interviewed both the contending parties, and they give me multiple contradictory results. The only thing they agreed on was who died and who killed the people that died. That's the only thing the Yanomamo would agree on. But anyway, so this is kind of, an anecdotal example of kin selection. So they probably, they stage after that killing occurs. They had killed 3 to 2. You think they'd say, okay, we're one up on you guys, but no. So they probably got together a raiding party. I estimate 60 to maybe 75, which I think is a really large raiding party. And they were going to go upriver and exterminate their enemies. But it was a 5-day trip. And by the time they got to the village where the enemies were, there were only 12 people left, all of whom were closely related to the victims in their group that had died. Everybody, made up some lame excuse, that their wife needed them back home to clear the garden or something like that. Huh?
Thorns in the feet.
Thorns in the feet. Dreams of jaguars is a good one too. That kind of portends you're in big trouble if you're dreaming about jaguars. But so the point is that you kind of get this collective action going on, and the only people who really want to put out for it were the people who had a real grievance because they lost close kin. But it brings us to the celebrated work by Knapp, the axe fight. Here's a clip from the video, I think. I steal images all the time, and I just forget, where I stole them from.
Who you stole them from?
Yeah, right. But basically, taking sides in a fight. A fight breaks out between two individuals in a village. It escalates with others taking part. The scene was captured on video, allowing identification and roles of supporters. The side of supporters selected was based on which of the initial two combatants he was most closely related to. So people, even broke ranks with their lineage affiliation, and they just sided with, the people that were most closely related to them. Here's one guy I really got to like, and he started the fight. This is Uua. His struck the first blow in the defense of his half-sister, Sina Bimi. So the fight, if you've seen the film, starts out. She's kind of a drama queen, I thought, and when I got to know her. But the important thing in that video shows that how women manipulate men into their own political ends. But he's a really fearsome guy, but he's a really nice dad too. He's just returned from a 4-day trip with a puppy that he's just presented to his son, and it's domestic bliss. I mean, look at the smile on his face. He's happy to be home. The kid's excited, and so I just thought I'd throw that out. I think finally, well, not finally. I have about 5 minutes left, is that right?
15 with questions.
15 with questions, so I've got about 10. You want me to end at 4?
We want questions you to end at 4.
Okay, so 12 minutes and 3 hour work, yeah. Okay. We're going to... One thing I want to take a look at is now labor exchange and food exchange. We've got lots of research on food exchange, not a bunch of research on labor exchange. And so I'm talking about the quantitative research I did on them, got some behavioral data. And one thing that really surprised me was that if you look at total garden labor, what turns out is that 60% of their labor is allocated to their own gardens, but 40% is allocated to gardens owned by other people. That's a lot of cooperation going on. And so, how is that cooperation pattern? And what I did was to develop some measures of exchange intensity, the sum of how much each household dyad worked in the other's gardens, the sum of A worked in B's garden and B, et cetera. So that's the intensity of exchange between two households. Balance is the difference, ignoring the sign, between how much each household dyad worked in each other's gardens. So if one household worked 50 times and the other one 30 times, then the difference would be 20, and so that's a measure of imbalance. And then relatedness between households. And basically, in this kind of a situation, there was a positive correlation between dyadic relatedness and intensity of exchange. So people who were closer related exchange more frequently. And there was even a stronger positive correlation between dyadic balance and relatedness. There's close relatedness positively correlated with imbalance, which means that close kin were willing to invest way more than they received in return to their close kin compared to distant kin. And it kind of echoes the pattern that we see in other societies where even if kin don't reciprocate, you still keep caring for kin. And this also works in this kind of population. But here's the wrong approach. And I may get some people unhappy here because I see people like John Zeiker's here and others are here in the audience. If we look at food sharing, what we find is that in a number of studies shows that kinship explains food sharing, especially among with meat sharing. But many other studies, me included a couple of times, shows that reciprocal altruism is the pattern that governs exchange, and kinship has nothing to do with exchange. And what we've been doing, we've been kind of groping along in that we do a strategy, let's test kin selection, reciprocal altruism, proximity, how close you live to someone, demand sharing or consumer-producer ratios, which is a measure of need that a family might have. A family that has lots of dependent offspring, you to predict that they would be getting more, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really nice because we have these multiple hypotheses tested. But the real problem is we start making ad hoc arguments as to why a certain pattern falls out as opposed to another pattern. So that's the kind of good and bad. And what I would argue, and I've argued this in several places, is that if we're looking at food exchange, presumably food or labor exchange is cooperation designed to more efficiently overcome a particular problem or task. So identify what that problem is that sharing is designed to overcome before you begin to make predictions about the mechanism, whether it's kin selection or reciprocal altruism. And so we have some candidates. Risk of failing to achieve a good daily dietary intake, food security kind of argument as manifested in illness insurance, for example. Sharing goes on because foragers are, Larry Sugiyama showed this, injured quite a bit. And so by sharing, you're kind of paying your premiums, and when you become ill, you get to collect the benefits, and so it works out for everybody. Or the kind of classic example for sharing among hunting and gathering societies is hunting has such high variance that if you were only to depend on one hunter, you'd have a high probability of starving or going without food or adequate food for a long period of time. There's advantages of an economy of scale, meeting peak labor loads. All these are different sorts of things that can be done cooperatively and much more efficiently through the cooperation that we should essentially try and understand. After we know the advantages of cooperation, then we can develop hypotheses about who should cooperate and on what scale. And so that's the problem I see in terms of this research that I've done, and I've done this kind of ad hoc sort of thing. Except for the Yekwana Garden Labor Exchange, I really did have good information from them that the reason they exchanged so much and shared so much was because if they fell short in their own productivity, the labor they put in to other gardens could be essentially reclaimed through harvesting from those gardens. We have other problems too, but I'm not going to go to them. Here are some generalizations. Paternity certainty or maternal leaks do matter. That's a real solid result from all the kin selection, inclusive fitness studies. I think it's fair to say women more frequently deploy kin-directed nepotism than men. They have a longer reproductive lifespan, men do, and as a consequence can engage in a mating effort. But the literature on alloparenting, helpers at the nest, grandmothers, and something else I forgot to mention that Martin Daly and Catherine Solomon developed, the kind of kin keeper hypothesis, the idea that, or the demonstration that women know kin better, feel closer to kin, keep in contact, maintain ties, et cetera, except for the Yanomamo, the kinship knowledge for at least most human populations is greater for women, so they're more avidly interested in assisting their kin. Reciprocal altruism, as I mentioned before, cheap and easily tracked altruism and kin selection for high cost benefit altruism. That's been demonstrated a lot. For example, among the Yakwana garden labor exchange is done through done through kin biases. Meal sharing is not reciprocal altruism, and I can't get into it to explain it, but also if you look at Yanomamo food sharing, again, there's no kin biases in Yanomamo food sharing, but there's strong kin biases in coalitionary fights. So, these mechanisms, whether it's reciprocal altruism or kin selection, depends on the problem that people are trying to overcome. Reproductive value and benefit predicts the flow of altruism. Most altruism is flowing from the older generation to the younger generation. The Chimani data magnificently demonstrates this. The will data really well demonstrates this. The alloparental care data really demonstrate this. And so that's an important kind of generalization. Kin recognition is affected by co-resident, and again, this is the Westermark effect, and maternal perinatal association. I think this is a really solid finding, but again, we'd like to be able to extend it because, mom and dad and brother and sister, aren't your only kin. You've got all these other, and we don't really have, I think, good explanations for how altruism develops or the like. Some of the work ahead. We need more predictive models of what mode of evolutionary cooperation will be employed under particular conditions. That's the point I made about the food exchange data, because there are other different kinds of evolutionary mechanisms that can account for cooperation and sharing. My read of literature indicates that we need to do more work on emotions and cognitive architecture underlying kin altruism and how they develop. This is, perhaps a difficult area to study, but I think an area that should be studied more intensively. We need to understand, as I mentioned, better understand kin recognition as it relates to those outside of the nuclear family. For example, as I mentioned before, can the maternal perinatal association account for grandparental solicitude? We need to better understand local resource competition affects kin relations and intrafamilial dynamics, in that kin can compete with one another. And Monique Berghoff-Mulder has done a lot of really good research in this area, and we haven't kind of looked at those instances where kin can actually engage in nasty competition. And then the issue of, the lineal links over the lateral links in wills. Again, I think, wills is just a relatively unexploited area. I mean, it's been exploited pretty well, but, this is your last opportunity to do anything for your kin. And sometimes we're talking about lots of money. And why people don't study this more often is, I'm not sure. Anyway, so I think I'll end it there and be ready to try and answer some questions. Thank you.